It wasn't the jumpers themselves, but what remained that transported her to another time and another place. Delruba Hammoudi, a street vendor in Lower Manhattan, watched the 9/11 attacks in real time, in real life, trapped in a dark memory. As body after body crashed to earth from the cloudless blue sky, she recalled the lawless Afghan village of her youth, the village she came to Manhattan with her father to escape. What emerged, the sense of horror, the absence of safety, the feeling of chaos, these things brought her back. Meanwhile, a family in Corrington, Tennessee, watching not in person but on TV, processed the scene differently. For the Knauss family, like many American families, it was a fever dream born in hell. Unlike Delruba, they had no personal parallel experience from which to process what they saw. Like many American parents, they tried to explain it to their boys. 3-year-old Ryan, 7-year-old Tyler. They couldn't. Dazed American citizens wearing suits running through the streets of Lower Manhattan covered in soot, ash-blackened faces, eyes wide with shock. American planes turned into guided missiles, the noses of 3 of them functioning like incendiary bullets under the body of the ribcage carrying through vital organs on their way out the other side. The spilling of blood in the most influential, most protected streets on earth. As the Knauss family watched their television flicker between images of dark smoke billowing towards the sky in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, they knew at once that life that has existed before was dissipating into that blackened air. We would never be here again. Yet, 20 years later, new scenes of panic, terror, and chaos in Kabul brought Delruba, the Knauss family, and many of us back. The images played over and over and over on the cable news channel of terrified Afghans, of chaos. For many, the timing was too cruelly ironic. One image in particular was brutally reminiscent of 9/11. You've seen the video clip. It's 2 Afghans falling from a cloudless blue sky as their desperate hold on an Air Force C-17 loosens. At a glance, the video paralleled the scenes that played out in front of Delruba in real time. The bodies that Tennessee family saw on TV 20 years ago, desperate men and women dropping from that Manhattan sky after making a choice no one should have to make. Among those 2 Afghans who make it to Delruba's adopted country was 17-year-old Zaki Anwari, a member of Afghan's national soccer team. Zaki clung to the wheel of the C-17 in the impossible hope that he could somehow hang on all the way to America. All the way, perhaps, to the spot Delruba Hammoudi found herself on that clear Tuesday morning. Zaki had to try, even if it meant falling to his death. These images are horrific bookends to the last 20 years. How do we reconcile what's happened in between those 2 events? The 7,306 days between the planes hitting those buildings and today. In writing the speech, I tried to understand it, make sense of it all. At least some meaning is to be found in the 4,431 service members killed in Iraq and the 2,423 killed in Afghanistan. Those are the wars we waged after 9/11. Those 6,854 must mean something. Nathan Ross Chapman was the first. He was a Green Beret who looked like a Green Beret. Solid build, square jawline, and opposing figure. The San Antonio, Texas native joined the Army right out of high school in 1988. Delruba was still in her House Province village that year. No one was paying attention to Afghanistan at the time. Nathan earned his Green Beret right there at Fort Bragg in 1994. He died January 4th, 2002 at age 31 in Gardez, the capital of Paktika province. 2 years later, in that same capital city where Nathan died, a child was born, Zaki Anwari, the boy who fell from a plane. Nathan Chapman left behind wife Renee, 1-year-old son Brandon, and 2-year-old daughter Amanda. Late in 2002, in Delruba's birthplace, less than 10 miles from the walled hut in which she grew up, we named a forward operating base after Nathan Ross Chapman. So Nathan was the first soldier to die in Afghanistan. The last soldier to die in those wars was that 3-year-old boy watching the 9/11 attack with his family on TV in Tennessee. Ryan Knauss, the youngest son, was by then 23 years old. He was a staff sergeant assigned to the 1st Special Forces Command here on Fort Bragg. He's remembered by his wife, Elena. Ryan was among 13 service members who died in the suicide bombing attack at the Kabul airport on Thursday, August 26. 11 Marines, a Navy corpsman, and Ryan, an Army soldier. All 13 service members died helping men, women, children, babies, and the elderly to refuge. They died trying to evacuate people in the darkest hour. That is the ultimate act of compassion. They were not killed in a firefight. They were instead killed trying to bring people who have nothing to safety. They did so knowing the danger, knowing that terrorists were targeting them at the airfield. They died protecting and defending people in desperate need of protecting and defending. Ryan was the last of those 13 to die. Ryan, the final casualty of this war, was a member of the group that was the very first Army unit to set boots on the ground in Afghanistan back in November 2001. I guess time is circular in Afghanistan, 2 decades in the blink of an eye. Delruba Hamoudi praised at Renee Chapman and Elena Knauss. She praised the families of the 2,421 men and women killed in between them. She mourns these men and women she's never met. All of them. All of the service members who served at some point in some part of Afghanistan over the past 20 years have a piece of the answer to that question. What does it all mean? The friendships, the camaraderie, the relationships forged, those things mean something. The people saved, the people that 114,000 Afghans evacuated in a stunning 16-day period. The darker moments, they mean something too. The missed birthdays, the missed softball games, the divorces, the suicides, the brain injuries, the PTSD, the horrific injuries, the deaths. Now that war is over, but the search for meaning is just beginning. And I certainly don't have the answers. But I know that the qualities our soldiers displayed over the past 20 years, the grit, the love for one another and our Afghan partners, the loyalty to those values, those are the lifeblood of this nation. They have to be. And make no mistake, our soldiers fought with more discipline and compassion than in any of our previous wars. Those soldiers made this country safer in ways most will never know. They took more evil off the planet than their nation will ever realize. It was harder, so much harder than the American public will ever understand. It was impossibly hard right down to those final moments when that final American soldier boarded the final C-17. We've never asked the American soldier for the kind of discernment we ask our privates, squad leaders, and company commanders in Afghan villages every day. Judgment in the kind of lawless villages that Delruba grew up. And there are so many critical moments. There was the opening salvo, the massive bombing campaign in the north and east that was to quickly end the war. There was Operation Anaconda. There was the declaration in early 2003 that major combat operations in Afghanistan were over. The resurgence of violence in 2006, the surge recovery, the development of Afghan forces, the Bin Laden raid, the tragic Extortion 17 flight that Schmidt shot down that killed 38 service members. The war meant so much to all of us, so much so that many of you are on Fort Bragg. But that war never infused culture, never inspired music and movies like the Vietnam War. Perhaps that's because, unlike our previous wars, so few American citizens actually participated in the war in Afghanistan. So many Americans served in Vietnam, 1.8 million from 1963 to 1973. Draftees, volunteers, and enlistees. 3 times as many people served in Vietnam than in Afghanistan in half the time. By contrast with Vietnam, so many Americans have been disconnected from Afghanistan. So, perhaps we here on Fort Bragg have an obligation to make sense of it. And the war may not have ended the way we wanted it to. It may not have been as clean as we would have liked it. But no military could have evacuated as many people as we did in such a short amount of time with so much risk incurred. One image of that effort calls to mind what the last 20 years mean. One image demonstrates why the nation has served as a clarion call to people like Kurilla. It's a video that stands in stark contrast to those horrific broadcasts the Canals family saw on television 20 years ago. It's an image of a terrified Afghan mom in Kabul last month handing her baby to an American Marine. A man in an American uniform she'd never met, whose name she didn't know, an act of desperation, an act of trust. There is a reason they hand their babies to us. There's a reason that woman knew her baby would be cared for. In that moment, that woman believed in the promise of America in the same way we did on September 10th, in the same way our forebears did 250 years ago, in the same way Kurilla's father did when he made his way to Manhattan in 1993. The promise is this: America is still the guiding light of self-determination of the world, as it was in the minds of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who basked in the first-time glow of the lamp raised above the New York harbor. Those men and women we lost on August 26th were the physical and spiritual embodiment of that guiding light. A poetic coda of the 20-year endeavor in Afghanistan. They were so young, entire lives laid out ahead of them. Some of them were younger than the war in Afghanistan itself. Some of them born after planes flew into the World Trade Center. They represent a unique vision of a coherent society based on a shared set of values. Within that meaning, perhaps we can say that our divisions are not so intractable. Perhaps the fact that we can give voice to our disagreements, that we can come together in discussion over our differences, is actually a great strength. As I watched the heroism shown by our service members in Kabul to evacuate Americans, partners, and allies, I was reminded of that great strength. I was reminded of a similar group of heroes on Flight 93. Early that Tuesday morning on September 11th, United Flight 93 was set for nonstop travel from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco. A diverse group of 40 passengers and crew on board. Terrorists overtook the cockpit, determined to crash the Boeing 757 into the U.S. Capitol. Those 40 passengers and crew fought and died defending people they didn't even know. Similarly, on that same day, almost at the same time, another group of Americans came together to save their fellow citizens. Hundreds of civilian ferry operators, private boat operators, and Coast Guards responded within minutes of the second plane hitting the second tower. They rushed to the lower tip of Manhattan, and they were quickly organized a mass evacuation. These strangers came together to transport more than 500,000 civilians to lower Manhattan in the hours after the attack, more than were evacuated at Dunkirk. We saw the same spirit of self-response last month. A loose collection of veterans and nonprofit organizations came together in encrypted chat rooms with one goal: finally evacuate the Afghans who fought to serve us over the past 20 years. These patriots scrambled for donations, tracked down charter planes, and enlisted old friends. Some veterans actually went to Afghanistan to personally guide at-risk Afghans to safety. Some of the press called it the Pineapple Express because the group used photos of pineapples as identification. Some call it the digital Dunkirk. I call it among the most daring large-scale rescue attempts in modern human history. We'll likely never know how many thousands of Afghans these groups saved. In such valor, we find meaning in 9/11. Ryan Knauss's widow, Alina, just said the other day in an interview, to help those people and to know he was helping people, he would not be sorry. He would not regret it. That is the American ideal. The willingness to sacrifice it all on a plane or on a foreign soil to save your fellow countrymen who are serving at the seat of a democratic republic, to save those seeking that guiding light. That's what brought Kurilla community here. That's what drove Zaki and Lori to cling to that aircraft. We represented something so pure that a young mother would hand her newborn baby to a stranger, knowing that in America, that baby will be protected, cared for, and have an opportunity to become whatever they want it to be. There are long-term consequences for failing to remember these values, for failing to treat our fellow countrymen with the dignity and fellowship we all deserve. Perhaps all over the world, people all over the world are living with the violent, brutal consequences of failing to cultivate the kinds of values Americans displayed on 9/11 and American service members displayed in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. The values of selflessness, of individual liberty, of valor, of sacrifice of fellow citizens when lacking lead to lawlessness. Evil fills the void. But as long as we uplift and honor those values, As long as we find meaning in our selflessness, in the incredible composure and courage of Elaine Haas to represent Ryan, as long as military service remains selfless, valued throughout the country, divorced from the political discussion of the day, and faithful to the Republic, we will never find those consequences ourselves. It must be so. So in the coming days, look up from your screens, let's look at each other. Let's re-engage in our values. Let's consider what we represent to the Delruba Hamudi, to the men and women driven to our shores by dreams only we know to be true. We owe it to Atlantic Mouse, to the memory of the 2,423 men and women killed in Afghanistan. We owe it to the American service members altered by our post-9/11 wars. We owe it to ourselves and what we believe we are all about. Most importantly, we owe it to the next 20 years. Thank you.